The lamp oil runs low. In the suffocating darkness of the burial chamber, something moves through water that should not be there. The sound is wrong scales against stone, massive and deliberate. It's August 1891, deep beneath the necropolis at Saqqara, and British expedition leader Thomas Whitmore watches his lamp flame shrink to a pinpoint. In that dying light, he sees it. The serpent coils fill the corridor ahead, each loop thick as a man's torso, stretching back into shadows that his mind refuses to measure. But it's the head that stops his heart massive, flat, with eyes that reflect his lamplight in a way no living thing should. The ancient Egyptians carved warnings about this creature into every temple wall. They called it Apep, the serpent of chaos, the enemy of Ra, the devourer of sunlight. They said it lived in the waters of the underworld, waiting to swallow the sun each night. Thomas Whitmore had dismissed those warnings as mythology. He was wrong. The serpent's head rises higher, its jaw beginning to open, and in the tomb's stale air he smells the Nile at flood season mud and death, and something older than memory. This is the moment when legend becomes truth, when the boundary between myth and reality dissolves like morning mist over the river, and there is nowhere to run. This is the story of the Saqqara expedition of 1891, when a team of British archaeologists and Egyptian tomb workers opened a sealed chamber that had remained untouched for over 3,000 years. What they found inside was not treasure. What they found was a warning system, an elaborate architectural trap designed to contain something the ancient Egyptians feared more than death itself. The hieroglyphs covering every surface told the same story in obsessive repetition. Apep dwells in darkness. Apep drinks the river of night. Do not breach the seal. Do not let light touch the water below. The ancient Egyptians knew Apep well. In their mythology, this serpent was not merely a monster, but the physical embodiment of chaos, the eternal enemy of Maat, the cosmic order that held reality together. Every night, as Ra's solar bark traveled through the underworld, Apep attacked from the primordial waters, attempting to swallow the sun and plunge the world into permanent darkness. Priests performed rituals each dawn to weaken the serpent, to bind it with spells, to cut it into pieces that would regenerate by nightfall. They drew images of Apep in red ink on papyrus, then burned the papyrus to wound the actual creature in the spirit realm. They believed the serpent was real, that it lived in a dimension parallel to our own, and that certain places, certain tombs, certain chambers deep beneath the sand touched the dimension closely enough that the barrier could break. The 1091 expedition was led by Thomas Whitmore, a veteran of multiple Egyptian excavations, a man who had spent 15 years dismissing local superstitions and folklore as the ignorant fears of simple people. He brought with him 6 British colleagues, including the expedition's physician doctor, James Ashford, the surveyor William Brennan, and the photographer Marcus Grell. They hired 20 Egyptian workers from the villages near Saqqara, men whose families had worked the tombs for generations and who carried knowledge passed down through centuries. These workers tried to warn them. They pointed to the seal on the chamber door, intact after 3 millennia. They showed them the protective spells carved into the threshold stones. They refused, at first, to help break the seal. But gold speaks louder than caution, and the British Museum had funded this expedition generously. The seal was broken on August 14th, 1891, just after dawn, when the air was still cool and the desert had not yet begun to shimmer with heat. What happened in the days that followed would be documented in expedition journals, in letters sent back to London, in the testimony of survivors given to colonial authorities. The official report would call it an accident, a tragic case of flooding and structural collapse. But the private journals tell a different story. They speak of water rising from stone where no water should exist, of sounds in the darkness that matched no known animal, of a presence that grew stronger each night, as if something ancient was waking from a sleep measured in dynasties. And at the center of it all, in the deepest chamber beneath the sand, they found not a burial but a prison, a place designed to hold something that could not be killed, only contained. The ancient Egyptians had sealed Apep in stone and spell, and now, in their arrogance and their hunger for knowledge, the expedition had set it free. This is the dark story of Apep, the world encircler, the enemy of light, the serpent that devours the sun. This is the story of what happens when you break a seal that was meant to last forever. The expedition had been working the Saqqara necropolis for 3 weeks before they found the entrance. It was not marked on any map, not mentioned in any previous excavation report. The stone that covered it bore no royal katu, no identifying inscription, only a series of protective spells carved so deeply that sand had never filled them. The hieroglyphs were repetitive, obsessive, the same phrases hammered into the rock again and again. Here lies the bound one. Here darkness is chained. Let no man break this seal. The Egyptian workers recognized the spell formation immediately. These were not funerary texts, but containment spells, the kind used not to guide souls through the afterlife, but to imprison something that should never be released. Dr. Heinrich Weber dismissed their concerns. He had not traveled from Berlin to let superstition impede scientific progress. The stone blocking the entrance was removed on a Thursday morning in March 1923, requiring 4 men and a system of levers that took most of the day to position correctly. The seal broke with a sound like cracking ice, and the air that emerged from within carried a smell that none of the expedition members could adequately describe in their journals. Weber wrote only that it was ancient and wrong, while his assistant, James Whitmore, noted it reminded him of meat left in a closed room for years, but somehow still vital. The passage descended at a sharp angle, the walls unmarked, except for more protective spells that appeared at regular intervals, as if the builders had reinforced the binding every few meters. The expedition's Arabic translator, Omar Hassan, refused to read them aloud. He would only say that they invoked Serpent, the scorpion goddess, and called upon her to maintain her watch for eternity. Serpent was a protector deity, yes, but she was also associated with containing poison, with binding venomous things that threatened the cosmic order. Her presence here suggested something specific. Whatever lay below was venomous not just to the body but to reality itself. The chamber at the bottom was circular, carved from solid bedrock with a precision that seemed impossible for the tools available in ancient Egypt. The floor was covered in a substance that had once been liquid bitumen mixed with something else, something organic that had blackened and hardened over millennia. At the center stood a stone sarcophagus, unlike any Weber had encountered in his 20-year career. It was not designed to be opened. Iron bands, corroded but still intact, wrapped around it in a pattern that mirrored the protective spells above. The lid had been sealed with molten bronze poured into channels carved around its edge, creating an airtight barrier that would have required sustained, intense heat to create. But what captured Weber's attention, what made him step closer, despite the sudden reluctance of his legs to obey, were the scratches on the inside of those bronze seals. Deep grooves, dozens of them, all radiating outward from within. Something had tried to claw its way out. The marks were worn smooth by time, but their desperation remained legible in stone and metal. Weber photographed them methodically, his hands steady even as his expedition journal would later reveal a single underlined sentence. The scratches were made after the sarcophagus was sealed. In the beginning, before the first dynasty, before the pyramids rose from the sand, the ancient Egyptians looked at the world and saw order fighting chaos every single day. They called this order Ma'at, truth, balance, justice, the fundamental structure that kept the stars in their courses and the Nile in its banks. and they believed chaos had a name, a form, a physical presence that attacked Mart every night when the sun descended below the western horizon. They called this chaos Apep, and they imagined it as a serpent so vast that it could coil around the entire world, its scales covering the horizon, its body filling the waters of the underworld. Apep was not evil in the way humans understand evil. It was something older, something that existed before good and evil were concepts. The priests taught that Apep dwelled in the darkness beyond creation, in a realm that existed outside time and space. Every night, as Ra's solar bark traveled through the Egyptian underworld, Apep would attack, trying to swallow the sun god and prevent dawn from ever breaking. The serpent's roar could shatter stone. Its gaze could paralyze gods. Most terrifying of all, Apep possessed a hypnotic power that the texts called the eye that drinks will. Those who looked directly at the serpent would lose their capacity for choice, becoming extensions of its endless hunger for dissolution. The theology was specific about Apep's nature in ways that made it unusual among Egyptian monsters. It could not be killed because it was not truly alive. It was uncreation given form, the absence of being that somehow possessed presence. The best the gods could do was bind it, cut it into pieces, drive it back into the darkness. The Book of Overthrowing Apep, a ritual text dating to the late period, describes the serpent's attributes with disturbing precision. A body that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, making it appear as a moving darkness, a voice that resonated at frequencies that could stop the human heart, and most significantly, the ability to speak backwards, to utter words that unmade rather than created, that dissolved the bonds holding reality together. Scholars have long debated whether Apep represented a real psychological or astronomical phenomenon, perhaps a poetic description of solar eclipses, or a metaphor for depression and social collapse. But the ancient Egyptians themselves never wavered in their literal belief. They performed rituals against Apep every day in every major temple. Priests would craft wax and papyrus effigies of the serpent, then burn them, stab them, spit on them, speaking the words that renewed its binding. These were not symbolic gestures. The priests believed that if they failed, if even for one night they did not perform the rituals correctly, Apep might succeed in swallowing Ra, and the sun would never rise again. The serpent appeared in royal texts as well, particularly in spells meant to protect the pharaoh during his own journey through the afterlife. But there was always a troubling subtext to these inscriptions. They spoke not of defeating Apep, but of avoiding its attention, of passing through the darkness without being noticed. Even the gods, it seemed, did not want to confront chaos directly. They wanted only to survive it, night after night, until the sun rose once more and order was restored. For another day. Thomas Whitmore had spent 15 years excavating tombs in Egypt, and he had developed a reputation for two things: meticulous documentation and absolute skepticism toward local superstition. He had heard every folk tale, every warning, every story of curses and guardian spirits, and he had dismissed them all as the natural fear of uneducated men working in darkness among the dead. His journals from previous expeditions are filled with contemptuous references to workers who refused to enter certain chambers, who insisted on performing protective rituals before moving stones, who claimed to hear voices in the tunnels. Whitmore saw himself as a man of science, a representative of British rationalism, cutting through centuries of primitive belief. The Saqqara expedition was to be his crowning achievement, the dig that would secure his name in the records of the British Museum. His journal entries from the first 2 weeks at Saqqara are predictably confident. He writes about the heat, the quality of the limestone, the promising architectural features that suggested significant finds ahead. He sketches the protective spells on the entrance stone with archaeological precision, noting their unusual depth and repetition, but attributing it to the obsessive religious character typical of the period. When Omar Hassan attempts to explain the specific nature of containment magic, Whitmore records the conversation but adds a dismissive note. Hassan exhibits the typical native tendency toward dramatic interpretation of standard funerary practices. But something changes in Whitmore's writing after they open the chamber. His handwriting, previously neat and controlled, becomes irregular. The entries grow longer, more detailed, obsessively focused on small observations that seem to disturb him in ways he cannot quite articulate. He describes the smell from the open chamber, not once but across 3 separate entries, each time adding new details, as if trying to capture something that language could not properly hold. He notes that the air did not dissipate as stale tomb air normally would, but seemed to linger, to follow the workers back to the surface, to cling to their clothes and tools. On March 16th, 5 days after opening the chamber, Whitmore records something that breaks entirely from his usual style. The entry begins normally enough, discussing the photographic documentation of the sarcophagus, but then shifts mid-paragraph. Weber asked me 3 times today what I was listening for. I was not aware I had been listening. But he is right. I find myself pausing in my work, tilting my head toward the passage entrance, as if expecting to hear something rise from below. There is nothing. The chamber is silent, and yet hangs there, followed by blank space, as if Whitmore could not find words for what came next. His technical observations remain sharp. He notes the temperature differential between the chamber and the surface. The sealed room is inexplicably colder, several degrees below what the depth and insulation would predict. He documents that none of their oil lamps burn properly in the chamber. The flames gutter and smoke, regardless of the wick quality or oil purity. Most puzzling, he records that their pocket watches all run slowly while underground, losing approximately 7 minutes per hour, though they resume normal function upon return to the surface. But interspersed with these scientific anomalies are stranger observations. He writes about dreams, though he prefaces this apologetically, noting it is unscholarly to record such matters. In these dreams he stands before the sarcophagus, and the bronze seal is not solid but liquid, rippling like water disturbed by something moving beneath. He can see the scratches from inside, still being made, the metal parting in thin curls under pressure from claws that he knows, with absolute dream certainty, have been scraping at the seal for thousands of years without pause, without rest, without any diminishment of strength or patience. The final entries before the opening grow increasingly fragmented. Whitmore begins writing in the margins, adding observations hours after the initial entry, as if thoughts keep occurring to him that demand immediate documentation. He notes that Hassan has stopped coming to the site entirely, forfeiting his pay rather than descend into the chamber again. He records that 2 of the Egyptian workers have left without explanation, and that the remaining men now work in complete silence, refusing to speak while underground. And in an entry dated March 20th, written in pencil so faint it is barely legible, he admits something that seems to cost him greatly. I do not want to open the sarcophagus. Weber insists we proceed tomorrow. I have prepared my equipment, but I find myself hoping for rain, for sandstorm, for any delay that might be justified. This is not scientific caution. This is fear. The Egyptian workers knew something was wrong the moment they cleared enough sand to reveal the seal. The oldest among them, a man named Rashid, whose grandfather had worked with Belzoni 70 years earlier, refused to go closer than 10 paces from the entrance. He stood in the morning sun with his hands pressed together and spoke in rapid Arabic to the other workers, his voice tight with fear. The British expedition members could not understand his words, but they understood his tone. Their translator, a young man from Cairo named Hassan, went pale as he listened. When pressed to explain, Hassan said that Rashid was speaking about old knowledge, warnings passed down through generations of tomb workers about certain chambers that should never be opened. Rashid's grandfather had taught him to recognize the signs. There were tombs built for the dead, he explained through Hassan's reluctant translation, and there were tombs built for other purposes. The dead slept peacefully if the proper rituals had been observed. But some chambers were not graves at all, they were prisons. The hieroglyphs on this seal were not funerary texts meant to guide a soul through the duat. They were binding spells, the kind written by priest-magicians who understood that some things could not be destroyed, only contained. Rashid pointed to the repetitive nature of the inscriptions, the way they circled the entrance in concentric rings, each ring reinforcing the one before it. This was not decoration. This was a lock with 7 layers. Hassan grew increasingly uncomfortable as he relayed Rashid's explanations. The old man spoke of specifics that seemed to disturb him more than the general warnings. He said that his grandfather had once worked on a similar chamber near Abydos, one that bore comparable seals, invoking circuit. The expedition leader had insisted on opening it despite the workers' protests. According to the story, the chamber had contained not mummies or treasure, but a single black stone basin filled with something that moved in the lamplight, something that had no business moving after 3,000 years in darkness. The expedition leader had ordered the basin opened. Within a week, every man who had touched it was dead not from disease or accident, but from what the doctors could only describe as sudden cardiac failure, their hearts simply stopping in sequence, youngest to oldest, as if something was working its way through them in order. The other workers began to join Rashid in his refusal. By the afternoon, Weber had 12 men willing to work on the seal, down from the original crew of 30. Those who remained did so primarily out of financial desperation, and even they insisted on certain precautions. They wanted to perform a protective ritual before breaking the seal, burning specific herbs and reciting prayers that Hassan said dated back to the Old Kingdom. They wanted to work only during daylight hours, never after sunset. Most importantly, they wanted time several days to prepare themselves spiritually, to make arrangements for their families, to put their affairs in order, as if preparing for a dangerous journey rather than a simple excavation. Weber refused all of it. He accused them of theatrical superstition designed to extract more money from the expedition's limited budget. He reminded them that science had dispelled such darkness, that educated men no longer cowered before ancient symbols they did not understand. Hassan did not translate this speech with his usual precision. He softened Weber's contempt, added phrases about respect for tradition, tried to build a bridge between the German archaeologist's certainty and the workers' fear. It made no difference. Weber wanted the seal broken immediately. Rashid gathered his tools and left the site without another word, walking back toward the Nile with his shoulders set against whatever anger or consequences might follow. 5 other men joined him. By evening, the expedition had 6 workers remaining, all young, all poor enough that the promise of British wages outweighed the warnings of their elders. They used iron pry bars to break the seal, working in shifts because the stone was thick and the mortar between the blocks had been reinforced with some mixture that had hardened like concrete over the millennia. The work took most of the morning. As each block was loosened, a smell emerged from the gap knot, the usual tomb smell of dry dust and ancient linen, but something wetter, more organic, like river mud. Dr. Ashford, standing nearby with his medical bag, remarked that it reminded him of the Nile during flood season, that peculiar scent of disturbed silt and decaying vegetation. But there was no water source anywhere near this part of the necropolis. The ground was bone dry, had been dry for centuries. The workers who were prying the blocks began to slow their efforts. One of them, a young man named Khalil, stopped entirely and stepped back from the entrance, his pry bar clattering to the ground. He was staring at his hands. Hassan approached him, asked what was wrong. Khalil held up his palms. They were wet, not with sweat, but with something else, something that glistened darkly in the morning light, and carried that same smell of river silt. He had not touched anything wet. The stone was dry, but his hands looked as though he had plunged them into the Nile. Weber inspected Khalil's hands himself, touching the substance cautiously. It was slick, viscous, and it did not evaporate in the heat the way water should have. He took out his handkerchief and wiped Khalil's palm, and the cloth came away stained with something that was not quite black and not quite green. The stain spread on the white linen in a pattern that looked disturbingly purposeful, like veins branching outward. Weber folded the handkerchief and put it in his pocket, his face betraying nothing, but Whitmore noticed that the German did not touch the substance with his bare hands again. As the final blocks were removed, the darkness beyond the entrance seemed to resist the daylight. Whitmore recorded this observation in his journal with careful precision, noting that the shadows inside the passage did not behave as shadows should when exposed to direct sunlight. They remained dense, almost tangible, as if the darkness itself possessed weight and substance. When Hassan lit an oil lamp and held it toward the opening, the light penetrated only a few feet before being swallowed entirely. It was like looking into deep water at night. The lamplight simply stopped, absorbed by something that should have been empty air. The passage descended at a steep angle, the walls smooth and unmarked, except for those repeating protective spells that appeared every few meters. The hieroglyphs were carved deep enough that even in the poor light, they cast their own shadows, creating the illusion that the symbols were moving, shifting position as the lamp passed. Hassan read them aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Let circuit's sting be eternal. Let the coils hold. Let the sleeper remain bound in darkness until the stars fall and the Nile runs backward to its source. Ashford asked what kind of funeral text would include such imagery. Hassan did not answer immediately. When he did, his translation was halting, uncertain. This is not a funeral text, Doctor. This is a spell of eternal imprisonment. These words are meant to hold something that cannot die but must not be allowed to wake. He paused at the next set of hieroglyphs, his lamp wavering. And this part here, this asks Circuit to forgive them for what they have bound in her name, because even the goddess should not have to watch over such a thing forever. Weber had already started down the passage, his own lamp held high, his boots scraping against stone worn smooth by what might have been ancient feet or ancient scales. Whitmore followed, then Hassan, then the remaining workers who moved like men walking toward their own execution slowly, reluctantly, but unable to turn back. When the last stone was removed and they entered with torches and oil lamps, they found a chamber unlike any they had seen before. It was not a burial room. There was no sarcophagus, no canopic jars, no funerary furniture. Instead, the walls were covered floor to ceiling with hieroglyphs, carved with such intensity that the chisel marks were still sharp after 3,000 years. The ceiling was lower than usual, barely 7 feet high, creating a sense of oppression. And strangest of all, the floor sloped downward toward the far wall, where a second sealed entrance waited in shadow. William Brennan, the surveyor, immediately recognized the architectural purpose of the sloping floor. It was designed to channel water, to direct any liquid toward the lower chamber. But there was no water in Saqqara. The necropolis sat on high ground, deliberately chosen for its aridity, its distance from the Nile's seasonal flooding. A drainage system here made no practical sense unless the builders had anticipated something else, some other fluid that might need to be contained, directed away from the upper levels toward whatever waited below. Hassan began reading the hieroglyphs while the others set up the photographic equipment. His voice grew quieter with each translated passage. The texts were not prayers or historical records. They were warnings, instructions, and apologies written by priests whose names appeared with unusual frequency. These men wanted to be remembered, wanted future generations to know who had done this terrible necessary thing. The inscriptions identified them as servants of Serpent of the 12th dynasty, a period known for its administrative efficiency and architectural ambition, not for its theological innovations or magical practices. The text described a problem. Something had come up from the Nile during an unusually low flood season, emerging from the mud near Abydos. The priests did not name it directly, referring to it only as the fragment or the piece of the great serpent. They wrote that it had been sleeping in the river mud for uncounted years, perhaps since the time of the first kings, perhaps since before kings existed. When drought exposed it to air, it woke. The papyrus records from that period, Hassan explained, mentioned livestock deaths, mysterious illnesses, and a village where every inhabitant simultaneously lost the ability to speak, standing in their homes in complete silence until they died of thirst days later. The priests of Serpent had been summoned. They performed rituals to contain the fragment, using methods that the hieroglyphs described in disturbing detail. They wrapped it in linen soaked in natron and scorpion venom circuits, sacred poison, concentrated from thousands of specimens collected over months. They recited binding spells for 40 days and 40 nights without cessation, working in shifts so the words never stopped. And when the fragment was finally dormant, wrapped so tightly it could not move, could barely breathe if such a thing breathed, they built this chamber in the driest place they could find, as far from the Nile as possible, while remaining within reach of the sacred precinct. The hieroglyphs ended with a plea written larger than all the rest, carved so deeply that shadows pooled in the letters, even in lamplight. Let no man move what we have bound. Let no curiosity unseal this chamber. The fragment dreams of the great serpent from which it was severed. In its dreams it calls to Apep. If it wakes, it will call louder, and Apep, coiled in the darkness beyond creation, will hear its child crying out in hunger. Weber stood before these final words with his lamp raised, reading them himself, though his hieroglyphic knowledge was limited. Whitmore watched the German's face, expecting skepticism, scientific dismissal. Instead, he saw something unexpected: excitement. Weber turned to them, his eyes bright in the lamp flame. Do you understand what this means? They believed they had captured a piece of their chaos god, a physical fragment of Apep itself. He moved toward the second sealed entrance, the one toward which the floor sloped. And they put it down there? Marcus Grell, the expedition photographer, spent an entire day photographing the hieroglyphs in the first chamber, while Hassan translated them aloud for Whitmore's notes. The texts were not prayers or historical records. They were instructions, repeated hundreds of times with minor variations. They described how to maintain the seal, how to strengthen the binding spells, how to recognize the signs that the containment was weakening. They listed the offerings that should be made at the threshold, not offerings to the dead, but offerings to keep something dormant. Red bread, blood of bulls, iron filings mixed with Nile water. And throughout the texts, one name appeared again and again, written in red hieroglyphs that stood out against the black basalt walls: Apep. Grell's photographs captured something the human eye struggled to process in the lamplight. The hieroglyphs were not uniform in depth. The protective spells had been carved and then recarved. Some symbols cut so deep into the basalt that they extended nearly 3 inches into the stone. Hassan noticed it first while running his fingers across the wall, tracing the outline of Serpent's scorpion symbol. The grooves showed evidence of multiple carving sessions, each one deepening the previous work. It was as if successive generations of priests had returned to this chamber to reinforce the spells, to make them more permanent, more powerful, as if they feared the original words were not strong enough to hold forever. The maintenance schedule was explicit. According to the inscriptions, priests were supposed to enter this chamber every new moon to perform renewal rituals. They would burn specific incenses myrrh, mixed with the dried bodies of scorpions, and recite the binding formulas, while walking the perimeter of the room exactly 7 times. The instructions emphasized that this ritual must never be neglected, not for war, not for famine, not for any earthly disruption. The priests who failed in this duty would answer not to the pharaoh but to Ma'at herself, for they would be responsible for loosing chaos back into the ordered world. But there was a deeper instruction, one that Hassan hesitated to translate fully until Whitmore insisted. On the western wall, written in a hieroglyphic script so archaic that Hassan had to consult his reference books, was a set of emergency procedures. If the containment showed signs of failure and the text listed these signs with disturbing specificity, the priests were to seal the chamber permanently. Not just close the door, but fill the entire passage with rubble and molten bronze, making it impossible for anyone to enter or, more importantly, for anything to leave. The instruction was absolute. Better to bury the knowledge and lose whatever was contained here forever than to risk it escaping into the world. The signs of failure that required this drastic measure were documented with clinical precision. The first sign, moisture appearing on the walls despite the chamber's location far from any water source. The second sign, sounds emanating from the lower chamber, specifically described as the scraping of scales on stone or breathing where there should be no breath. The third sign, dreams experienced by those who had entered the chamber, dreams of darkness that moved with purpose, of coils tightening around the sleeper's chest until they woke gasping. Whitmore read through Hassan's translation 3 times before speaking. These aren't metaphorical warnings. These are practical instructions written by people who expected this containment to eventually fail. He looked toward the second sealed entrance, the one leading to the lower chamber. They built this place knowing it was temporary. They were buying time, not creating a permanent solution. Grell had stopped photographing. He was staring at his camera, at the photographic plates he'd been using to document the walls. "There's something wrong with these," he said quietly. "The exposures are correct, the focus is sharp, but look at this." He held up a developed plate, tilting it toward the lamplight. The hieroglyphs were clearly visible, perfectly captured. But in several of the photographs, there were shadows that shouldn't exist, dark shapes in the corners of the frame where nothing had been standing, where no one had cast a shadow. And in one plate, the photograph of the western wall with its emergency procedures, there was something else. A thin, dark line running vertically through the image, like a crack in the stone. But when they examined the wall itself, there was no crack. The basalt was solid and unbroken. The entrance to the lower chamber was not blocked with stone, but with a solid copper door, green with age, covered in spellwork so dense that there was barely room for a fingernail between the carved symbols. Copper was sacred to the ancient Egyptians, associated with Hathor, with protection, with boundaries between worlds. This door had been cast as a single piece, no seams, no joints, and set into the doorframe with such precision that no light passed through the edges. When the workers approached it to examine the seal, several of them stepped back immediately and refused to touch it. One man, a young worker named Ahmed, said later that he felt a vibration through the stone when he placed his hand near the door, a rhythmic pulse, like something breathing on the other side. Weber dismissed the claim as nerves, but Whitmore decided to test it himself. He placed his palm flat against the copper, holding it there for a full minute while the others watched. His journal entry that evening was characteristically precise. Temperature of copper door significantly lower than ambient chamber temperature. Surface vibration detectable, regular interval, approximately 7 seconds. Possible geological explanation: underground water flow, despite apparent aridity of site. Alternative explanation: metal resonance from human activity on surface above. Neither explanation entirely satisfactory. What Whitmore did not record in his journal, but mentioned years later in a letter to his sister, was what he thought he heard while his hand was pressed to that copper door. A sound so faint it might have been imagination, might have been blood rushing in his own ears, might have been the natural settling of ancient metal. But it sounded, he wrote, like scales sliding across stone. Continuous, patient, methodical movement in the darkness beyond the door. Hassan read the spells carved into the copper, his voice barely audible. These were not the same protective formulas from the outer chambers. These invocations were older, written in a hieroglyphic form that predated the 12th dynasty, perhaps dating back to the Old Kingdom or earlier. They called upon gods whose names Hassan recognized only from the most ancient religious texts, deities who had been already archaic when the pyramids were built. Acre, the double lion god who guarded the horizon. Nehibkau, the serpent deity who bound together the Ka and the Ba, life and death, and most prominently carved in hieroglyphs that spiraled around the door's center. Circuit, portrayed not as a protective goddess but as an executioner, her scorpion tail raised to strike, her venom described as the sleep that does not end, the paralysis that preserves without mercy. The door itself was locked not with a key or bolt, but with 7 copper pins driven through the frame into the door, each pin as thick as a man's wrist. The pins had been sealed in place with molten gold that had cooled in thick beads around each insertion point. It was a locking mechanism designed not for security, but for permanence. This door had been meant to stay closed until the metal itself decayed to powder. Dr. Ashford examined the copper carefully, noting the unusual thickness, nearly 4 inches of solid metal. "This isn't a door that was meant to be opened and closed," he observed. "This is a plug. They poured this door into place and sealed it while the metal was still cooling. Look at the way the edges have fused with the stone frame." He ran his finger along the junction where copper met limestone. "This door has never been opened, not once, not ever, since the day it was installed." But there were scratches on the inside face of the copper. They could see them where the patina had worn thin in certain spots, revealing brighter metal beneath. Deep parallel grooves, sets of 4 or 5 running vertically down the door's surface, as if something with claws or scales with edges like broken glass had scraped at the barrier from within, testing its strength, searching for weakness, year after year after year, with the patience of something that did not measure time in human terms. To understand what the ancient Egyptians believed about the chamber beneath Saqqara, we must understand their concept of the underworld, the Duat, the realm through which the sun god Ra traveled each night in his solar bark. The Duat was not simply a land of the dead, but a complex geography of rivers, gates, demons, and tests. Ra's journey through this realm took 12 hours, each hour representing one of the night's divisions, and at multiple points along the route, Apep attacked from the primordial waters. The Serpent rose from none, the waters of chaos that existed before creation, and attempted to swallow Ra's bark whole. If Apep succeeded, the sun would not rise, and the world would end. The theological texts describe Apep's attacks with remarkable consistency. The Serpent did not ambush Ra randomly, but waited at specific locations, shoals in the underworld river, where the bark moved slowly, narrow passages where the solar boat could not maneuver easily. The most dangerous moment came during the 7th hour of night, when Ra passed through a region called the Kingdom of Sokar, a place of absolute darkness where even the sun god's light dimmed to almost nothing. Here, Apep was strongest, coiling in the deep water with only its massive head breaking the surface, jaws wide enough to eclipse the bark entirely. But Ra did not travel alone. His defenders gods like Set, the storm god, and Serpent, the scorpion goddess, fought Apep each night. Set stood at the prow of the solar bark with a spear, driving it into Apep's hide as the serpent struck. Serpent positioned herself at the stern, her venom paralyzing the creature when Set's physical attacks could not penetrate its scales. The ritual texts describe these battles in language that is disturbingly visceral for religious literature. Apep bleeds, though its blood is described as liquid darkness that poisons the primordial waters. It roars, and the sound causes souls in the duat to forget their names. It writhes when wounded, and its coils create whirlpools that drag damned souls into the abyss. Most importantly for understanding the Saqqara chamber, the Egyptians believed that Apep could be divided. Several versions of the underworld books describe Set cutting pieces from the serpent during particularly fierce battles. These fragments would sink into none, disappearing into the chaos waters, but they did not dissolve or die. The texts are explicit. Pieces of Apep retained the nature of the whole. They remained conscious, malevolent, hungry for the ordered world. Worse, the fragments called to each other and to their source. The theology held that if enough pieces were reunited, Apep could reconstitute itself, could emerge from the darkness stronger than before, because it had learned from its defeats. This created a theological problem that occupied priestly scholars for generations. If fragments of Apep existed in the physical world, perhaps emerging during unusually low Nile floods that exposed deep river mud, or surfacing in desert sinkholes that reached down to primordial water, what should be done with them? They could not be destroyed because they were pieces of something that predated creation itself, something that existed outside the cycle of life and death. Destruction was a concept that applied to created things, and Apep was uncreation given form. The solution, according to texts found in temple archives at Abydos and Heliopolis, was containment through isolation. The fragments must be kept from water, which connected them to none, and thus to the whole serpent. They must be kept in darkness, but a darkness controlled by Ma'at, bound by order and spellwork. Most critically, they must be kept dormant through the specific intervention of Serpent, whose venom could paralyze even chaos itself. The priests developed elaborate rituals of binding and sealing, methods passed down through centuries, refined through experience with forces that should have remained mythology, but apparently did not. The copper door beneath Saqqara, with its invocations to Serpent and its unprecedented thickness, its permanent sealing, and patient scratches from within, suddenly made terrible sense as more than religious architecture. It made sense as a practical solution to an impossible problem. The copper door took 2 days to open. The ancient craftsman had not used hinges, but some kind of pivot mechanism embedded in the stone, and 3,000 years of stillness had seized it solid. They applied oil, they heated the metal with torches, they pried at the edges until the copper bent. Finally, on the morning of August 18th, the mechanism gave way with a sound like a long exhalation, and the door swung inward into darkness that their torches could not fully penetrate. The smell that emerged was overwhelming, that Nile mud scent, but intensified, as if the chamber beyond was flooded with river water. Yet when they shone their lamps through the opening, they saw only stone stairs descending into shadow, completely dry. Ahmed, the worker who had felt the vibration through the door, refused to enter. He stood at the threshold with his lamp held high, but would not cross into the stairwell. When Hassan asked him why, Ahmed said simply that the air coming from below was wrong, not stale, not dead wrong. He said it felt like breath on his face, warm and moist, with a rhythm to it that made him think of something sleeping. The other workers gathered near the entrance showed similar reluctance, standing in a loose semicircle around the doorway but maintaining careful distance, as if proximity to the opening itself carried risk. Weber went first, descending the stairs with his lamp held before him. Whitmore followed, then Grell with his photographic equipment, then Ashford. Hassan came last, translating the hieroglyphs carved into the stairwell walls in a voice that echoed strangely in the enclosed space. These inscriptions were different from those in the upper chamber, shorter, more urgent, almost conversational in tone. They were messages from the priests who had sealed this chamber, personal notes added in the final hours before the copper door was closed forever. One inscription, carved hastily near the fifth step, read, "Forgive us, Circuit, for we have imprisoned your eternal task. The fragment does not sleep deeply. We hear it moving below." Another, near the 10th step, was more disturbing. 3 days of binding rituals. The venom takes hold, but slowly. It dreams while paralyzed. In its dreams it calls to the great Serpent. We must finish the sealing before the call grows loud enough to be heard in the far darkness. The stairs descended 47 steps. Whitmore counted them carefully before opening into a circular chamber carved from bedrock. The floor was concave, sloping toward a central depression approximately 10 feet in diameter. And in that depression sat a stone basin, massive and ancient, filled with a substance that had once been liquid but had long since solidified into something that resembled black glass. The surface was smooth, reflective in the lamplight, and perfectly level despite the slope of the floor around it. But it was what lay beneath the surface that made them all stop, made their breathing catch, made Grell lower his camera without taking a single photograph. The substance was transparent enough that they could see through it, could see the shape preserved within like an insect, trapped in amber. It was perhaps 12 feet long, though the coiled position made exact measurement difficult. The body was serpentine but wrong in ways that defied easy description. The scales were not arranged in regular patterns, but seemed to overlap chaotically, each scale catching the lamplight differently, some appearing to absorb light, while others reflected it with an oily iridescence. The thickness varied along its length, sometimes as narrow as a man's wrist, sometimes swelling to the diameter of a barrel, without the gradual taper a natural creature would possess. There was no head visible. Either it was tucked beneath the coils, or this fragment had been severed before head formation, or the head existed in some configuration their eyes could not properly register. But they could see movement, slight, almost imperceptible, but definitely movement. The coils shifted minutely, perhaps once every 30 seconds, a slow rhythmic contraction and release that suggested breathing or something analogous to breathing. Whitmore's hand shook as he wrote in his journal by lamplight. The priests were not mythologizing. This is real. This is actually real. 6 men made the first descent into the lower chamber: Whitmore, Dr. Ashford, Brennan, Grell, and 2 Egyptian workers who had been with the expedition since Cairo. They carried 4 oil lamps, a coil of rope, surveying equipment, and a revolver that Whitmore kept holstered at his belt. Though what he thought he might shoot in a sealed tomb 3,000 years old, he could not have said. The stairs were steep and narrow, carved directly from the bedrock, and they descended much farther than any of them had anticipated. Brennan counted the steps 73 in total, which meant they were now more than 50 feet below the surface, well beneath the normal depth of any known tomb structure in Saqqara. The walls of the stairwell were covered with hieroglyphs, but these were different from the elaborate spellwork in the upper chambers. These were hastily carved, the strokes irregular and deep, gouged into the stone with what looked like desperate urgency. Hassan had remained at the top of the stairs, his voice echoing down to them as he translated the inscriptions by lamplight. The messages were fragmented, incomplete thoughts carved by priests working against time. The venom slows but does not stop. It knows we are here. Circuit, forgive us. The binding will not hold forever. Halfway down, Grell stopped suddenly. He was staring at his lamp, watching the flame with an intensity that made Whitmore pause as well. "The flame's pulling," Grell said quietly. "Not up, as it should with rising heat. It's pulling downward." They all looked at their lamps then and saw he was right. The flames were stretching toward the bottom of the stairs, straining against their natural behavior, as if something below was drawing them down like iron to a magnet. The air grew colder as they descended, each step taking them into a chill that had no business existing this deep in the Egyptian earth. Their breath began to mist, despite the season, despite the depth, despite every rational principle of underground temperature. Ashford noted it clinically, his medical training demanding observation even as his instincts screamed for retreat. 14 degrees Celsius at 40 steps, 11 degrees at 60 steps. Impossible thermal gradient for this depth and location. At the bottom of the stairs, they emerged into a chamber that defied the architectural principles of every tomb Whitmore had studied. It was perfectly circular, 40 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling that rose to a central point. The walls were smooth black basalt, polished to a mirror finish that reflected their lamplight in fragmented, distorted ways. And carved into this polished surface, covering every inch from floor to ceiling, were hieroglyphs so small and densely packed that they appeared as texture rather than writing, a continuous spiral of text that began at the floor and wound upward to the ceiling's apex. But it was the center of the chamber that held their attention. A stone basin, carved from a single piece of granite, sat in a depression in the floor. The basin was 10 feet across and filled nearly to the brim with a substance that looked like solidified honey, amber-colored, translucent, perfectly still. Within this substance, visible in terrible clarity, was the coiled form of something that should not have existed outside of mythology. It was serpentine, but wrong. The scales were not uniform but varied in size and shape, some large as a man's hand, others small as grains of sand, all of them overlapping in patterns that hurt to look at directly, that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally. The body varied in thickness without logic, narrow as a rope in some places, thick as a tree trunk in others, the transitions abrupt and geometrically impossible. There was no head visible, or rather, there were suggestions of heads in multiple locations, bulges in the coiled mass that might have been skull shapes, or might have been something else entirely. The creature was not still. Even trapped in the solidified resin or venom or whatever the ancient priests had used to bind it, the thing moved with glacial slowness. A coil would shift fractionally, perhaps once every minute, a movement so subtle that it could have been dismissed as trick of lamplight if all 6 men had not seen it simultaneously. And with each movement, the smell of Nile mud intensified, as if the creature's dreams were of the river, of the primordial waters from which it had been torn. At the bottom of the stairs, they found not a burial chamber, but a prison. The room was circular, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling that rose to a point where a small ventilation shaft had been drilled through the rock. But it was the center of the room that stopped them cold. A square pit had been cut into the floor, perhaps 10 feet on each side, descending into darkness, deeper than their lamplight could reach. Around this pit, carved directly into the stone floor, was a series of concentric circles, 7 rings of hieroglyphs spiraling inward toward the opening. And at the very edge of the pit, someone had placed offerings thousands of years ago. Clay vessels that had once held oil or blood, copper amulets shaped like knots, small statuettes of Thoth and Isis and Set, gods invoked to strengthen boundaries and maintain cosmic order. Brennan approached the pit cautiously, holding his lamp over the edge. The light fell perhaps 15 feet before being swallowed entirely by darkness that seemed thicker than mere absence of light. He dropped a small stone into the opening, and they all counted silently, waiting for the sound of impact. It came after nearly 4 seconds, a wet, heavy sound like something hitting mud rather than solid rock. The pit descended at least 80 feet, perhaps more, extending far below even the water table, far below any depth that made architectural sense. Hassan had followed them down, unable to remain above while they explored. Now he knelt at the outermost ring of hieroglyphs, his lamp held close to the floor, his voice shaking as he read the inscriptions aloud. These were not the protective spells from the upper chambers or the desperate messages from the stairwell. These were instructions for a ritual that had no parallel in any Egyptian text he had encountered. The priests were to descend into the pit once each new moon, carrying fresh scorpion venom, fresh blood from red bulls, fresh natron salt. They were to pour these offerings into the darkness, while reciting specific formulas that Hassan struggled to translate. The language was so archaic, so specialized, that entire phrases remained opaque to him. But the purpose was clear enough. The offerings were meant to maintain a binding, to keep something dormant, to prevent it from climbing. The hieroglyphs used the verb to ascend repeatedly, always in the negative. May it not ascend. Let it remain below. Bind it to the depths where even Ra's light does not penetrate. And woven throughout the ritual instructions was a warning that grew more emphatic with each ring closer to the pit. Do not call to it. Do not speak its name. Do not ask what it dreams. Above all, do not look into the pit when the moon is dark, for it looks back, and its gaze is the gaze of Apep, which paralyzes the will and drinks the soul. Grell set up his camera to photograph the hieroglyphic rings, working methodically despite the tremor in his hands. But when he developed the plates later that evening, he found something that made him return to Whitmore's tent, his face pale in the lamplight. The photographs showed the chamber accurately, the pit, the rings of text, the offerings arranged around the edge. But in every single photograph, there was a shadow in the pit that had not been visible to the naked eye. A shape, dark and coiled, that seemed to shift positions slightly between exposures, even though each photograph had been taken from the same fixed tripod position. The ventilation shaft in the ceiling bothered Ashford more than anything else. He stood beneath it, looking up at the narrow hole that extended toward the surface, and realized what it meant. This chamber had not been sealed permanently. The shaft allowed air to enter, which meant the ancient priests had expected to return here, had designed this space for ongoing ritual access rather than eternal isolation. But the shaft also meant that whatever was in the pit below could breathe, could survive indefinitely, could wait with the patience of something that existed outside human time. Whitmore made his decision quickly. They would not descend into the pit, not today, not without additional preparation and equipment. They would photograph, document, survey the chamber thoroughly, but they would not go deeper. Weber would be furious. The Germans' archaeological ambition would see this as cowardice, as wasted opportunity. But Whitmore's 15 years of experience, his scientific rationalism, his absolute skepticism towards superstition, all of it was telling him the same thing. The priests who built this chamber had known exactly what they were doing, and their warnings should not be dismissed as primitive fear. Hassan spent hours translating the spiral hieroglyphs around the pit, while the others explored the rest of the chamber. His translations grew increasingly disturbed as he worked his way from the outer rings toward the center. The spells were not about protecting the dead or ensuring safe passage to the afterlife. They were about containment, about binding, about keeping something from rising. The texts described Apep in detail: his length beyond measure, his hunger that could never be satisfied, his hatred of all light and life and order. They described how the priests of the Old Kingdom had performed a ritual to trap Apep in physical form, to bind a portion of his essence in a place where he could be controlled, where his attacks on Ra could be limited. But it was the third ring from the center that made Hassan stop reading aloud entirely. Whitmore noticed his silence and approached, asking what was written there. Hassan looked up, his face drawn in the lamplight. and said quietly that the text described what would happen if the binding failed. The language was specific, clinical, the same detached precision that characterized Egyptian medical texts when describing diseases or surgical procedures. If the fragment woke fully, if it managed to break free from the venom that paralyzed it, it would seek water, any water. It would crawl through rock if necessary to reach the Nile, and once it entered the river, it would begin calling to Apep with a voice that resonated through the primordial waters of Nun. The great Serpent would hear its severed piece crying out, and Apep would turn its attention toward the physical world with unprecedented focus. The text did not say that Apep would emerge or that the world would end. The priests were more nuanced than that. What they described was worse: Apep's attention. The chaos serpent, focusing its will on a specific point in the ordered world, trying to reach through the barriers that separated uncreation from creation. The effects would begin subtly failures of natural law in the immediate area, breakdowns of the principles that governed matter and energy. Water might flow uphill. Stone might become permeable. The dead might wake, not as the blessed dead of the afterlife, but as things that had lost the boundary between being and non-being. And it would spread, this contamination of order by chaos, radiating outward from the fragment like ripples in still water. The innermost ring contained emergency instructions. If the binding showed signs of failure, if the fragment began to wake despite the venom and the spells, the chamber was to be flooded with molten bronze. Not sealed flooded. The entire pit was to be filled with liquid metal, creating a permanent solid mass that nothing could escape. The ritual for this procedure was detailed with the same care as the binding ritual itself. 7,000 pounds of bronze, heated in furnaces blessed by priests of tar, poured continuously over the course of 3 days and 3 nights, while the most powerful binding spells known to Egyptian magic were recited without cessation. But there was a final note, carved smaller than the rest, almost as an afterthought at the very edge of the pit. Hassan translated it haltingly. If bronze fails, if the fragment cannot be contained by metal or magic, or the venom of Circuit herself, then seal the chamber and pray that the gods remember mercy. For we have done all that mortals can do, and if it is not enough, then the fault lies with creation itself for being too weak to contain what existed before it. Whitmore copied every word into his journal with mechanical precision, his hand moving across the page while his mind struggled to process what he was recording. These were not the writings of superstitious primitives frightened by shadows. These were practical instructions written by educated men who had dealt with something that terrified them on a fundamental level. The tone throughout was not hysterical but resigned, the voice of people who had inherited an impossible responsibility and were documenting their methods for whoever came after them. Ashford had been examining the offerings around the pit, cataloguing them with his medical precision. He called to Whitmore now, his voice echoing strangely in the domed chamber. The clay vessels had residue in them still, dried to powder after millennia. He had scraped samples from several vessels and examined them under his portable microscope. Bull's blood, as expected, natron salt. But also something else. Something organic that he could not immediately identify. The cellular structure was wrong, elongated in ways that did not match any tissue he had studied. When he mentioned this, Hassan looked up from the hieroglyphs and said quietly, "Scorpion venom concentrates in the tissues. Perhaps what you're seeing is tissue saturated with Circuit's gift." It was Dr. Ashford who first heard it. He was examining the offerings at the pit's edge when he froze and held up one hand for silence. The others stopped talking and listened. At first there was nothing, only the silence of deep stone. Then, very faint, very distant, they heard water moving. Not the drip of groundwater through limestone, but the sound of current, of volume, as if somewhere far below them, a river was flowing through channels that should not exist. Brennan immediately checked his survey notes. According to every geological map of the Saqqara Plateau, they were standing on solid bedrock with the water table at least 200 feet below. There should be no water here. They stood in silence, listening. The sound came and went, sometimes loud enough to be unmistakable, sometimes fading to the edge of perception. It had a rhythm to it, Whitmore noted, like breathing or tides. 7 seconds of sound, 7 seconds of silence, over and over. He timed it with his pocket watch, counting 3 full cycles before he was certain of the pattern. When he mentioned this to Hassan, the translator's face went grey. 7 was the number of binding rings around the pit. 7 was the number sacred to Circuit. 7 was the number of knots used to bind chaos in the oldest magical texts. Grell lowered a lamp on a rope into the pit, feeding out lines slowly while the others watched. The light descended 20 feet, 40 feet, 60 feet, growing smaller but never quite disappearing. At 80 feet, the rope went slack. It had reached the bottom. But the lamp illuminated nothing except wet stone walls glistening with moisture that had no source. The water sound continued, seemingly coming from beyond the walls themselves, from spaces that their limited light could not reach. Then the sound changed. It no longer resembled water but something else, something that made Ashford step back from the pit's edge with involuntary speed. It was scales moving across stone, the same sound Whitmore had half imagined while touching the copper door, but amplified, unmistakable, coming from the depths with horrible clarity. Long, continuous sliding, the friction of rough surfaces against smooth rock, rising from below like something waking, like something becoming aware that the silence above had been broken by voices and footsteps and light. Hassan grabbed Whitmore's arm, his grip painful in its intensity. "Pull up the lamp," he said, his voice barely controlled. "Pull it up now." Whitmore didn't argue. He hauled on the rope, hand over hand, pulling the lamp back toward the surface. But as it rose, the shadows in the pit seemed to shift, seemed to move with purpose, rather than simply retreating from light. Something down there was avoiding the illumination, pressing itself against the walls, and it was large enough that its movement displaced air, sent currents up through the shaft that made the lamp flame gutter and dance. When the lamp emerged, they all saw it. The glass was cracked, thin fractures radiating across the surface as if something had squeezed it, tested its strength with pressure that should have shattered it entirely. And clinging to the metal frame, barely visible in the lamplight, was a thin film of moisture that smelled exactly like Nile mud, exactly like the scent that had emerged when they first opened the chamber above. Ashford collected a sample on a glass slide, his hands shaking so badly that he nearly dropped it. Under the microscope later, he would find suspended in that moisture something that looked like scales, microscopic, translucent, arranged in patterns that seemed to shift even as he watched, as if they were trying to reassemble themselves into something larger, something whole. But he did not share this finding with the others until much later, when the implications had become too terrible to deny. The sound from below had stopped. The silence that replaced it was somehow worse, heavy with attention, with awareness. They had descended into this chamber, believing they were observers, scientists documenting ancient remains. But standing at the edge of the pit with the smell of river mud rising into dry stone air, with their lamp showing cracks that shouldn't exist, and their ears still ringing with the sound of scales on stone, they understood that they were not observers. They were intruders in a place where something had been waiting in forced sleep for 3,000 years, and their presence, their voices, their lights, their footsteps had begun to wake it. They set up camp in the upper chamber that night, unwilling to spend darkness in the prison room below. Whitmore established a watch rotation and insisted that 2 men stay awake at all times, though he framed it as precaution against structural collapse rather than anything more concerning. The Egyptian workers refused to sleep inside the tomb at all and made their camp outside, near the entrance, where they kept a large fire burning, even though the August night was warm. Around midnight, during his watch shift, William Brennan heard something that made him stand up from where he had been sitting near the copper door. It was a vibration through the stone, rhythmic and regular, almost like a pulse. He placed his hand flat against the floor and felt it clearly something massive was moving in the chambers below. He woke Whitmore immediately, keeping his voice low so as not to disturb the others. Together they stood in the darkness, their lamps turned low, and felt the vibrations cycle through the bedrock beneath their feet. 7 seconds of movement, 7 seconds of stillness. The same pattern they had timed at the pit's edge, but stronger now, as if whatever was causing it had drawn closer to the surface or had increased in vigor. Whitmore took out his pocket watch and confirmed the timing, then recorded it in his journal with a hand that he was annoyed to find unsteady. At midnight, Grell woke without prompting, sitting bolt upright in his bedroll with his eyes wide. When Whitmore asked what was wrong, the photographer said he had dreamed of drowning in the Nile, except the water was not water, but something thicker, darker, and it had been pulling him downward while something coiled below waited with its mouth open. The dream would not have been remarkable. Men often had disturbing dreams in ancient tombs, except that Ashford woke moments later describing the same dream in nearly identical detail. The dark water, the sense of being pulled down, the waiting presence below, patient and hungry. By 2 in the morning, none of them was sleeping. They sat together in the lamplight, speaking in quiet voices about what they would do when dawn came. Brennan wanted to seal the chamber immediately, to replace the copper door and fill the passage with rubble as the ancient priests had intended if the binding ever failed. Grell argued for documentation. First, they had barely scratched the surface of what this chamber contained, and walking away now meant abandoning one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in modern history. Ashford, practical as always, pointed out that they had no equipment to seal the chamber properly, no rubble to fill the passage, no bronze to pour into the pit. If they were going to leave, they would simply be leaving the chamber open, which seemed worse than maintaining their presence. Whitmore said nothing. He was listening to the vibration through the stone, counting the cycles, noting that they had increased in frequency. No longer 7 seconds between pulses, but 6. A small change, perhaps meaningless, perhaps not. He wrote it down, added a note about the shared dreams, underlined it twice. In the margin he wrote a question he did not speak aloud. Is observation itself a form of disturbance? At 3 in the morning, the vibrations stopped completely. The silence was immediate and total, as if someone had closed a door or severed a connection. They sat in the stillness, waiting for the pattern to resume, but it did not. The stone beneath them was dead quiet, and somehow this was more unnerving than the rhythmic pulse had been. Movement suggested life, suggested something contained and operating within predictable parameters. This silence suggested attention, suggested something had noticed them noticing it and had adjusted its behavior accordingly. Hassan appeared in the chamber entrance just before dawn, climbing up from the workers' camp outside. His clothes were dusty, his face haggard, and he carried something wrapped in cloth that he set down carefully before speaking. He said the workers had been discussing the situation throughout the night, and they had reached a consensus. The tomb should be sealed, and sealed immediately, but not by filling it with rubble. That would take too long, would require too many men working too close to the pit. Instead, they should perform the emergency ritual described in the hieroglyphs, the one involving scorpion venom and bull's blood poured into the pit while speaking the binding formulas. He unwrapped the cloth to reveal 3 copper vessels, old but not ancient, and several small wooden boxes. Inside the boxes were scorpions, dozens of them, collected from the desert during the night. The workers knew how to extract venom. It was knowledge passed down through generations, used for traditional medicine and protection amulets. They could provide the blood easily enough. What they needed was someone who could read the hieroglyphic formulas correctly, who could recite the binding spell in the proper pronunciation and sequence. They needed Hassan, and Hassan was terrified, but he was also the only one who could do it. Ancient Egyptian texts describe Apep in ways that seem contradictory until you understand that they were trying to describe something that existed partially outside normal physical reality. In some texts, Apep is 16 coils long, each coil large enough to crush a temple. In others, he is infinite, his body stretching through all the waters of the underworld without beginning or end. His scales are described as harder than granite, resistant to all weapons except the spells of the gods. His eyes are said to reflect no light but to absorb it, creating darkness around themselves. His mouth is large enough to swallow the sun, and his throat leads not to a stomach but to the void before creation, to none itself, the primordial chaos from which all things came and to which all things will eventually return. The Book of Overthrowing Apep, compiled during the late period but drawing on much older sources, provides the most detailed physical description. The serpent's body is not solid in the way created things are solid. Its flesh exists in a state between being and non-being, which is why weapons pass through it ineffectively. There is nothing substantial enough to cut. The priests understood this theologically. Apep was uncreation, the opposite of the generative power that Ra represented. Where Ra spoke words that brought things into existence, Apep spoke backwards words that unmade them. Where Ra's light revealed form and structure, Apep's darkness dissolved boundaries until nothing could be distinguished from anything else. But the texts also describe Apep as having very specific physical attributes that suggest the Egyptians were working from observation, not pure imagination. The serpent's scales are arranged in patterns that change depending on which part of its body is being described. Near what might be called the head, though the head itself is never clearly defined, the scales are small and overlap in regular formations. Toward the middle sections, they become larger and more irregular, as if the creature had grown by accretion rather than natural development. Some ancient illustrations show these scales as having edges, sharp enough to cut through stone when the serpent moves through the underworld tunnels. The color of Apep is consistently described across multiple texts as not black, a phrase that appears strange until you realize they're trying to describe something darker than the mere absence of light. The serpent absorbs illumination, creating a visible darkness around itself that can be perceived even when lamps are burning. Temple artists struggled to represent this in paintings and reliefs, usually resorting to leaving Apep's form as bare stone while painting elaborate colors around it, as if the serpent was a hole in the artwork itself. Most disturbing are the descriptions of Apep's interior anatomy. The creature has no heart, which in Egyptian theology meant it had no seat of intelligence or emotion. It operated on pure primordial impulse. It has no ba, no ka, none of the spiritual components that made up a complete being. It cannot die because it was never truly alive. The priests who dissected the fragments and the texts make clear that dissection was attempted, probably multiple times across different periods. Found that cutting into the flesh revealed not organs but more flesh, coils within coils, as if the entire creature was made of the same undifferentiated substance all the way through. The fragments presented their own theological problem. When pieces were severed from the main body of Apep during nightly battles in the Duat, those pieces retained all the essential properties of the whole. A scale could grow into a coil could develop a mouth, The fragments did not die or decay, but remained in a state of suspended potential, waiting for conditions that would allow them to reconstitute into something larger. This is why the binding rituals were so elaborate. The priests were not trying to kill something that could be killed, but to maintain something unkillable in a state of forced dormancy. The coffin texts include a spell titled, "For repelling the peace that crawls," which provides instructions for dealing with fragments that surface in the physical world. The language is clinical, practical, suggesting this was not theoretical, but based on actual procedures developed through experience. The fragment must be kept from water, which connects it to none and gives it strength. It must be paralyzed with venom that mimics death without causing death. It must be bound with words that reinforce the boundaries between being and non-being. And it must be watched, constantly, because the fragment dreams of the whole, and in dreaming it calls out across the darkness, trying to remember itself back together. On the morning of August 20th, they found water at the bottom of the stairs leading to the prison chamber. Not much, perhaps an inch deep, but it had not been there the day before. The stone was completely dry when they had first descended. Now water covered the lowest 5 steps, and the smell of Nile mud filled the stairwell. Doctor Ashford tested the water, expecting it to be groundwater seepage, and found it warm, almost body temperature, with a mineral content that matched no aquifer in the region. When they descended to the prison chamber, they found the pit at the center had filled. Where before their lamps had shown only darkness descending into unknowable depth, now they saw black water, its surface perfectly still, reflecting their lamplight like polished obsidian. Brennan's surveying instruments confirmed what should have been impossible. The water table in this area was documented at 230 feet below the surface. They were currently at 73 feet below surface level, according to his step count and altimeter readings. There was no geological mechanism by which water should be present here, certainly not water that had appeared overnight, filling a pit that had been empty for 3 millennia. He took measurements of the water's depth using a weighted line, feeding it down into the darkness. 20 feet, 40 feet, 60 feet. At 80 feet, the line went slack. It had reached what he assumed was the bottom, the same depth they had measured the previous day. But when he pulled the line back up, they all saw that the weight was gone. The rope had been severed cleanly, as if cut with a blade, though Brennan had felt no resistance, no sudden jerk, just the weight falling away into water that should not exist. And clinging to the cut end of the rope were several translucent fragments that looked like shed skin or scales, each one perhaps an inch long, curved, and sharp-edged. Ashford collected them carefully, his medical training overriding his fear, and placed them in a specimen bottle for later examination. The water level was rising. They could see it creeping up the pit walls, perhaps an inch every 10 minutes, slow but relentless. The 7 rings of hieroglyphs carved into the floor around the pit were already partially submerged, the outer 3 rings completely underwater. Hassan knelt at the edge of the 4th ring, the water lapping at his knees, and read the inscriptions that were about to disappear beneath the surface. These were the emergency protocols, the warnings about what would happen if water ever reached this chamber. Water was none, the primordial chaos. Water was the medium through which Apep moved through the underworld. If the fragment reached water, if it could immerse itself in that element that connected to the chaos ocean beyond creation, the binding would weaken catastrophically. Whitmore made a decision. They would attempt the renewal ritual that Hassan had described, the one involving scorpion venom and bull's blood. It was absurd, it was unscientific, it violated every principle of archaeological practice, but the water was rising and they had no other options. Weber was still at the expedition's main camp, unaware of these developments, which meant Whitmore was in command. He gave the orders, bring the copper vessels, bring the scorpions, send 2 men to the nearest village to purchase a bull. They had perhaps 6 hours before the water reached the 5th ring of hieroglyphs, and Hassan said the ritual required complete immersion of all 7 rings to work properly. The workers moved with desperate efficiency. They had been preparing for this, had anticipated the need, and the scorpions were already collected, the venom extraction process already begun. But acquiring a bull, transporting it to the site, performing the slaughter, according to the precise ritual requirements, all of this would take time they might not have. Ashford organized the men with military precision, assigning tasks, establishing a timeline, refusing to acknowledge the absurdity of what they were attempting. By noon, the water had reached the 5th ring. The smell of Nile mud was overwhelming now, filling the chamber with a humid warmth that had no business existing in the dry Egyptian summer. And beneath that smell, something else, a scent like copper and decay, like old blood that had never quite dried. Grell set up his camera to document the rising water, taking photographs at regular intervals. When he developed these plates later, he would find that each successive image showed not just higher water, but movement beneath the surface, dark shapes that shifted position between exposures, coils that seemed to tighten and release, a suggestion of something large becoming active after millennia of forced stillness. Marcus Grell had been photographing every stage of the excavation with his large format camera, creating a detailed visual record for the British Museum. On August 21st, he set up his equipment in the prison chamber to photograph the pit and the surrounding hieroglyphs. The exposure took several minutes in the low light, requiring complete stillness. When the plates were developed 3 days later in his portable darkroom, Grell found something that had not been visible to the naked eye. In the photograph of the pit, just below the water's surface, there were shapes coils, massive and dark, barely distinguishable from the water itself, but undeniably present. He showed the photograph to no one except Dr. Ashford, who examined it with a magnifying glass and confirmed that the shapes were real, not artifacts of the development process. Grell had taken 12 photographs in the prison chamber that day, each from a slightly different angle, each with a different exposure time to compensate for the poor lighting conditions. When he developed all 12 plates and laid them out in sequence, the progression was unmistakable. The shapes beneath the water were moving. Between the first photograph and the last, a span of perhaps 40 minutes, the coils had shifted position, had risen closer to the surface, had oriented themselves differently, as if whatever was below had detected the presence of the camera, had turned to face it. The most disturbing photograph was the final one, taken just before they left the chamber that evening. Grell had set up the camera at the very edge of the pit, positioning it to capture the submerged hieroglyphs of the innermost ring. The exposure took 6 minutes due to the failing light. When the plate was developed, it showed the hieroglyphs clearly, the ancient warnings carved into stone now covered by water. But it also showed something else, a shape breaking the surface in the background of the image, just barely visible in the upper right corner of the frame. It looked like a section of coiled body, thick as a man's torso, rising from the water and then descending again. The surface of this coil was covered in scales that appeared to be moving, even in the frozen instant of the photograph, overlapping and shifting in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Ashford used his medical magnifying glass to examine the scales in detail. Each one seemed to have fine ridges, almost like the growth rings on a tree, but irregular, chaotic. Some scales appeared translucent at their edges, as if they were not entirely solid or were in the process of forming or dissolving. Most peculiar was that the scales did not all reflect light the same way. Some appeared bright in the photograph, where lamplight should have darkened them, while others appeared dark, where they should have been illuminated. It was as if the creature's body did not interact with light according to normal physical principles. Grell wanted to show the photographs to Weber, to Whitmore, to make them understand what was developing in the chamber below. But Ashford convinced him to wait. The German archaeologist was already talking about opening the sarcophagus in the upper chamber, a different sealed container they had found near the entrance. If Weber saw proof that something in the lower chamber was active, was moving, was rising toward the surface, he might accelerate his timeline rather than slowing it. He might see it as confirmation that significant discoveries awaited, that delay was wasting precious opportunity. So Grell kept the photographs hidden, stored in a leather portfolio that he kept in his tent. But he could not stop looking at them, particularly that final image with the coiled shape breaking the surface. He began to notice details he had missed in his initial examination. The water around the emerging coil was disturbed in a way that suggested the shape had risen quickly, perhaps in response to the camera's shutter, to the sound or the presence of the observer. And if he looked very carefully at the darkest part of the water, where the pit descended into depths the lamplight could not penetrate, he could see something that might have been an eye, or might have been a reflection, or might have been his imagination imposing pattern onto chaos. But it looked back. That was what bothered Grell most. Whether it was an eye or not, whether the photograph had captured something real or was simply playing tricks with shadow and light, the image gave the overwhelming impression of something aware, something that had noticed it was being observed and had responded with curiosity or malice or recognition. He stopped sleeping well after that. The photographs remained in his tent, but he found himself unable to enter the space without looking at them again, without examining that final plate one more time to see if he had missed anything. If there were other details hidden in the grain of the image that would tell him what exactly they had disturbed by opening this chamber that had been sealed for 3,000 years. The incident that changed everything happened on the night of August 22nd. Thomas Whitmore had insisted on spending a night watch in the prison chamber itself, determined to observe whether the water level was rising and to document any seismic activity that might explain the vibrations. He took a single lamp, his notebook, and a pocket watch, and descended the stairs at sunset. Hassan, the translator, tried to stop him, explaining that the hieroglyphs explicitly warned against approaching the pit during darkness, but Whitmore dismissed this as superstitious nonsense. At midnight, the lamp flame began to shrink. Whitmore added more oil, checked the wick, cleaned the glass, but the flame continued to diminish until it was barely a spark. In the growing darkness, he heard something break the surface of the water in the pit. His journal entry from that night, written by trembling lamplight after he fled back to the upper chamber, provides the only first-hand account of what happened. The writing is less controlled than his usual precise documentation. The sentences fragmentary, as if he was recording thoughts as they occurred rather than composing measured observations. The flame did not gutter as flames do when starved of air. It withdrew, pulling back into itself, growing smaller and denser, as if something was draining it, temperature in chamber dropping rapidly, breath visible in August, in Egypt, impossible. The water cannot see it properly now, but can hear it. Movement. Displacement. Something large surfacing slowly, deliberate. The sound is not splashing. It is sliding. Coils against stone, against water. The smell intensifies. Nile mud, copper, something else, something organic and wrong. He recorded that he lit a second lamp, one he had brought as backup, but it behaved the same way. The flame shrank immediately upon ignition, as if the darkness in the chamber was actively hostile to light, was consuming it faster than the oil could feed it. In near total darkness, with only the faintest glow from his dying lamp, Whitmore stood perfectly still and listened. The sound from the pit had stopped. Whatever had surfaced was no longer moving. It was waiting. Then he heard breathing. Not the sound of wind through the ventilation shaft, not the natural acoustics of stone chambers, actual breathing, rhythmic and deep, coming from the direction of the pit. Each breath lasted approximately 7 seconds, followed by 7 seconds of silence. The same pattern as the vibrations they had felt through the stone, but now audible, present, occurring in the same chamber where Whitmore stood frozen with his back against the wall. His hand found his pocket watch by touch. He flipped it open, counting seconds in his head while the breathing continued. On the 7th breath, something changed. The exhalation was accompanied by a sound like words, like language, but backwards. Syllables that his brain tried to process as speech, but could not pass into meaning. Hassan had mentioned this in his translations, the hieroglyphs describing Apep's voice as words that unmake, speech that ran counter to creation, that dissolved meaning rather than conveying it. Whitmore broke. He admitted it in his journal with something approaching shame. 15 years of excavation experience, a reputation for skepticism and scientific rigor, and he ran. Ran from darkness and a sound that might have been wind, might have been acoustics, might have been his own fear creating patterns in noise. But he ran, stumbled up the stairs in near darkness, his dying lamp swinging wildly, illuminating the hieroglyphic warnings carved into the stairwell walls, warnings he had dismissed as primitive superstition. When he reached the upper chamber, he found Hassan waiting at the copper door, standing vigil with a lamp and an expression of profound sadness. The translator did not say, "I told you so." He simply asked if Whitmore was harmed. When Whitmore said he was not, Hassan replied, "The fragment knows you now. It heard you breathing. It felt your fear. That is what they wrote would happen if anyone stayed in the chamber during darkness. The fragment learns. It recognizes. It remembers." Whitmore's final entry for that night. "My lamp is functioning normally now. Full flame, steady burn. Whatever was draining the lights stopped when I left the chamber." Hassan is right. I was recognized. I was noticed. And I cannot shake the conviction that something in that pit was pleased I had come, pleased I had stayed, pleased I had finally understood that the warnings were not superstition but experience recorded by men who had learned these lessons at terrible cost. Whitmore's own journal entry for that night is brief and written in a shaking hand, very different from his usual precise script. He wrote, "The lamp failed at midnight despite adequate fuel. In the darkness I heard water displacement from the pit, large volume. When the flame recovered briefly, I saw a shape massive coils breaking the surface, each thicker than a man's torso. Scales visible in lamplight, dark with an iridescent quality that suggested great age. The head rose last, flat and broad like a cobra, but larger than any living serpent. The eyes reflected my lamp with a light that did not match the flame's color. I felt paralysis that was not fear, but something older. When I managed to retreat, it did not follow but watched my ascent. It is real. The priests were not recording myth. They were recording containment procedures for an actual entity. But there was more that Whitmore did not write that night. Details that emerged only later in letters to his sister and in testimony given to the Egyptian Antiquities Service during the subsequent investigation. He had not mentioned, for instance, that the scales on the creature's coils were moving independently of the body, shifting and overlapping in patterns that reminded him of breathing, or perhaps of gills opening and closing. Each scale seemed to possess its own minute autonomy, creating a rippling effect across the creature's surface that was mesmerizing in its complexity and utterly wrong in its biological impossibility. The head, when it finally rose from the water, did not emerge gradually, as a surfacing animal would. It appeared suddenly, as if it had been there all along, and Whitmore's perception had simply failed to register it. until some threshold was crossed. The flatness of the skull suggested a viper or cobra, but the proportions were distorted too wide at the base, tapering too quickly toward what he assumed was a snout, though he could not clearly see where the head ended and the neck began. The boundaries seemed to shift depending on the angle of his diminishing lamplight, but it was the eyes that destroyed his skepticism completely. They were not the eyes of a reptile, not the vertical slits he would expect in a serpent. They were larger, rounder, and they glowed with a light that his scientific training told him was bioluminescence, but which appeared wrong in its color, not the blue-green of deep-sea creatures or the yellow-green of fireflies, but a shade that he could only describe as anti-light, as if the eyes were not producing illumination, but were holes through which something from beyond normal space was leaking through. When those eyes fixed on him, Whitmore experienced the paralysis that the ancient texts had described. It was not muscular failure, not the nervous system shutting down in terror. It was something more fundamental, the sensation that his will to move had been noticed by something vastly older and had been denied permission to operate. He stood frozen, not because his body would not respond, but because the very concept of movement had temporarily been removed from his understanding of what was possible. The creature did not attack. This detail bothered Whitmore more than anything else in the aftermath. An attacking predator he could have understood, could have categorized within normal zoological behavior. But this thing simply observed him. The head swayed slightly, perhaps following the dying movements of his lamp flame, perhaps tracking his breathing, perhaps responding to stimuli he could not identify. And after what felt like an eternity but was probably less than a minute, the head descended back into the water, not diving but sinking, as if it had decided the observation was complete and there was nothing more to learn from this encounter. When Whitmore's lamp flame recovered, and he could never adequately explain how it recovered, how a flame that had been reduced to almost nothing suddenly returned to full strength, he saw the water's surface settling, concentric rings spreading outward from where the head had descended. But the rings were wrong too. They moved too slowly, as if the water had become viscous, and they did not dissipate naturally, but seemed to fold back on themselves, creating interference patterns that formed shapes almost resembling hieroglyphs before finally fading. He climbed the stairs slowly, his lamp held before him, checking behind himself every few steps, though he knew rationally that the creature was in the water, was contained by the pit, could not follow. But rationality had been fundamentally shaken by what he had witnessed, and the certainty that the creature was watching his retreat, tracking his ascent through the darkness with those impossible eyes, was overwhelming. By dawn on August 23rd, most of the Egyptian workers had abandoned the camp. They left during the night without taking their pay, without collecting their tools, simply walking away into the desert. Only Hassan remained, and only because he felt a responsibility to translate the warnings that the British were ignoring. He told Dr. Ashford that the workers had heard something during the night, a sound like stone grinding against stone, coming from beneath their camp, as if something vast was shifting position in chambers far below. The oldest workers recognized this as the sign that Apep was fully awake, that the containment was failing, and that anyone who remained near the tomb would be caught when the serpent finally broke free. Hassan had tried to convince them to stay long enough to perform the renewal ritual, to at least attempt the emergency procedures described in the hieroglyphs. But the workers had refused with a conviction that bordered on panic. One of them, an older man named Mustafa, who had worked excavations for 30 years, told Hassan that his grandfather had taught him to recognize the signs of when a tomb had gone wrong, when the work of containment had outlived its effectiveness and natural forces were reasserting themselves. The grinding sound was one such sign. The dreams were another. By morning, every worker reported the same nightmare of dark water pulling them down while something coiled, waited below. And most telling of all was the smell. The Nile mud scent had spread beyond the tomb itself. It now permeated the entire camp, clinging to clothes and equipment despite the desert's aridity. Mustafa said this meant the boundary between the contained space and the outside world was dissolving, that whatever had been imprisoned was beginning to assert itself beyond its physical location. He used a word that Hassan struggled to translate. Tuluth, which meant something like contamination, but with theological overtones, suggesting not just physical pollution but the spread of spiritual wrongness, of chaos leaking into ordered space. The workers had left behind a message, written in Arabic on the sand near the tomb entrance, using rocks arranged in careful letters. Hassan translated it for Whitmore and Ashford. "We have done what we could. We opened the way because you paid us, and because we need to feed our families. But we will not stay to see what comes next. The priests who built this prison are 3,000 years dead, and their magic dies with them. You have awakened something that was meant to sleep until the world ended. May God have mercy on you, for the old gods will not." Weber arrived from the main camp that morning, furious to find his workforce had deserted. He accused the remaining expedition members of allowing superstition to undermine the project's discipline, of coddling the workers' fears instead of maintaining proper authority. When Whitmore tried to explain what he had seen in the pit the previous night, Weber dismissed it as hallucination brought on by poor air quality and suggestibility. The water in the chamber was groundwater seepage, nothing more. The sounds were geological settling. The shared dreams were the result of eating the same contaminated food. Everything had a rational explanation if one had the courage to seek it, but Hassan noticed something that gave him pause. Weber's confidence seemed forced, his dismissals too quick, as if he was working to convince himself as much as the others. And when Weber announced that he intended to descend into the prison chamber that afternoon to document the pit properly, to prove that there was nothing in the water except silt and darkness, Hassan saw the German's hands shake as he checked his pocket watch, saw him glance toward the tomb entrance with an expression that was not quite fear, but was certainly not scientific curiosity either. Ashford pulled Hassan aside while Weber was organizing his equipment. The doctor wanted to know what the hieroglyphs said would happen next, assuming the containment was indeed failing. Hassan had been translating the outermost rings, the emergency protocols and warnings, but there were inner rings he had not yet read, inscriptions carved so close to the pit's edge that they would now be underwater. He suspected these contained the final stage of the containment's failure, the description of what would emerge when all the binding spells had been exhausted. Hassan promised to wade into the water to read them, though the thought terrified him. But he felt a responsibility that went beyond his employment with the expedition. His family had lived in Egypt for generations, had survived invasions and dynasties and empires by understanding when to fight and when to flee, when to preserve and when to destroy. The hieroglyphs were his people's history, their accumulated wisdom about forces that the modern world had forgotten, but that had never truly gone away. If the British would not listen to the workers' warnings, perhaps they would listen to the words of priests who had faced this same crisis 3,000 years ago and had left instructions for exactly this moment. The ancient Egyptians believed that Apep attacked Ra's solar bark at multiple points during the night journey, but the most dangerous moment came in the 7th hour of night, when Ra was deepest in the underworld and farthest from the living world. At this hour, Apep would coil his massive body around the bark and attempt to stop Ra's progress through constriction. Awe, Etoe, Awe, Etoe, 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 Etoe would take up weapons and fight alongside Ra's crew, stabbing at Apep with spears, cutting at his coils with knives of iron. But Apep could not be killed, only wounded enough to make him release his grip. By morning he would regenerate, and the cycle would continue. This was the eternal battle that prevented chaos from destroying order. The Book of Gates, a funerary text found in multiple New Kingdom tombs, provides the most detailed description of these nightly confrontations. The text emphasizes that Apep's attack was not random violence, but strategic warfare conducted with terrible intelligence. The serpent knew the route Ra's bark must take through the duat. There was no alternative path, no way to avoid the confrontation. The geography of the underworld was fixed, and certain passages were narrow enough that the solar boat could not maneuver quickly. Apep waited at these choke points, his body coiled in the primordial waters, his presence creating whirlpools and turbulence that slowed Ra's progress even before the physical attack began. The theological texts describe Apep's constriction technique with uncomfortable precision. The serpent did not simply wrap around the bark like a python crushing prey. Instead, Apep's coils would phase partially out of physical reality, passing through the boat itself to strike at Ra directly. The priests understood that Apep existed simultaneously in multiple states, physical and non-physical, present and absent, real and conceptual. This meant that conventional weapons were only partially effective. A spear thrust into Apep's flesh would wound him, would cause him pain and force him to withdraw, but it would not create lasting damage because the flesh itself was not entirely real, in the way created matter was real. Set, the storm god, played a crucial role in these battles, standing at the prow of Ra's bark with a spear of meteoritic iron metal that had fallen from the sky and thus partook of celestial rather than earthly nature. Set would drive the weapon into Apep's skull repeatedly during each attack. The violence of these encounters was depicted in temple reliefs with unusual graphic detail. Apep bleeding from multiple wounds, his coils thrashing in the underworld waters, his jaws open in silent roaring that no living human could hear, but which the dead souls fighting alongside Ra experienced as a physical force that could stop their hearts. Serket's role was different, but equally essential. While Set engaged Apep physically, the scorpion goddess would position herself at the stern of the bark and sting the serpent's body at precise points where major vessels or nerve clusters existed. Her venom, described in the texts as the poison that makes stillness, would partially paralyze Apep, slowing his movements enough that Ra's bark could break free from the coils and continue its journey. But the paralysis never lasted long. Apep's regenerative capacity was so profound that even divine venom wore off within hours, leaving him ready to attack again the following night. The coffin texts include a passage that describes what would happen if Apep ever succeeded in fully constricting the solar bark, if Set and Serket failed in their defense, if Ra was prevented from completing his journey, the sun would not rise. This was not metaphor or theological speculation. The texts present it as mechanical certainty. Ra's emergence on the eastern horizon each dawn was the direct result of his successful transit through the duat. If the journey was interrupted, if Apep's coils held the bark trapped in the seventh hour of night, then darkness would persist indefinitely. But there was a deeper fear beneath this theological framework. The priests who composed these texts understood that Apep was not merely trying to stop Ra's progress. The serpent was trying to consume the sun god, to draw him into that throat that led to none, to pull ordered creation back into the primordial chaos from which it had emerged. If Apep succeeded, the result would not be simple darkness, but uncreation, a reversal of the generative act that had brought the world into being. The stars would unmake themselves. The Nile would forget its course. The souls of the dead would dissolve back into undifferentiated potential. Everything that possessed form and name and identity would lose these attributes and return to the state before Ra first spoke the words that initiated creation. On the afternoon of August 24th, against all advice, Whitmore organized a final descent to photograph the pit in daylight, using mirrors to channel sunlight down the stairs. He believed that documenting what was in the water would either prove the presence of some unknown species of serpent, a discovery that would justify all the risks they had taken, or would reveal a natural phenomenon that would debunk the supernatural fears that had seized the expedition. He took Dr. Ashford, Marcus Grell with his camera, and Hassan with him. William Brennan remained at the top of the stairs with a rope, ready to pull them up if anything went wrong. They reached the chamber to find the water had risen to within 5 feet of the pit's rim. The 7 rings of hieroglyphs were now completely submerged. Hassan waded into the water warm, uncomfortably so, with that persistent smell of Nile mud, and tried to read the inscriptions through the murky surface. But the water had become increasingly opaque over the past days. What had been clear enough to see through was now dark, almost black, as if something had clouded it from within. He gave up after several minutes, reporting that he could make out only fragments, disconnected phrases that seemed to be warnings about the final stage of containment failure. Grell set up his camera while Ashford positioned the mirrors to bounce sunlight down the stairs and into the chamber. The effect was eerie artificial daylight in a space that had known only lamplight and darkness for 3 millennia. The additional illumination revealed details they had missed before. The walls of the chamber were not uniformly smooth, but showed signs of water damage at various heights, suggesting the pit had filled and drained multiple times over the centuries. Perhaps during periods of unusual Nile flooding, or perhaps when previous priests had performed renewal rituals that involved water, or perhaps, and this thought made Whitmore deeply uncomfortable, when whatever was in the pit had previously attempted to escape. The water's surface was perfectly still, despite the presence of 4 men moving around its edge. No ripples, no disturbance, as if the water was too thick or too heavy to respond to normal physical forces. When Ashford dropped a small stone into the pit, they watched it sink, watched the water part around it, but no rings spread from the point of impact. The stone simply disappeared into the darkness below, and the surface sealed behind it like a wound closing. Grell took his first photograph, the magnesium flash powder igniting with a brilliant flare that illuminated the entire chamber for a fraction of a second. In that instant of perfect light, they all saw what was in the water. Coils, massive and dark, filling the pit from wall to wall, stacked upon each other in impossible density. The creature or creatures, they could not tell if it was one entity or many, was larger than the pit should have been able to contain. The coils extended downward into darkness that the flash could not penetrate, suggesting depth far beyond the 80 feet Brennan had measured. But it was the movement that froze them all in place. The instant the flash ignited, the coils shifted. Not the slow, glacial movement they had observed before, but rapid, purposeful reorientation, as if whatever was in the pit was reacting to the light, was turning to face it. And, rising from the center of the coiled mass, was something that might have been a head, or might have been several heads merged together, broad and flat, with a surface that did not quite resolve into coherent form, even in the brilliant magnesium light. Hassan began reciting something in Arabic, his voice low and urgent. When Whitmore asked what he was saying, the translator responded without stopping his recitation. Protective verse. Quran. The priest's spells have failed. Only God can help us now. His face had gone pale, and his hands were shaking, but he continued the recitation while backing slowly toward the stairs. Grell prepared for a second photograph, his hands moving mechanically through the process despite the visible tremor in his fingers. He inserted a new plate, measured the exposure, prepared the flash powder. But before he could ignite it, the water began to move. Not rippling, not disturbed by something beneath the water itself, was rising, climbing up the sides of the pit in defiance of gravity, reaching toward the rim in thick, dark tendrils that maintained their shape instead of flowing or splashing. Ashford grabbed Grell's arm. "We need to leave now." But the photographer was transfixed, watching the water through his camera's ground glass, documenting what was happening even as his scientific training screamed that it was impossible. The tendrils reached the pit's rim and began spreading across the chamber floor, moving with deliberate purpose toward the four men, leaving behind wet trails that smelled overwhelmingly of river mud and copper and something else. Something organic that had no name in any language they knew. Whitmore made the decision. Up, everyone up the stairs. Leave the equipment. They ran, Grell abandoning his camera, Hassan still reciting his protective verses, Ashford bringing up the rear with his medical bag clutched to his chest. Behind them, they could hear water know. Not here, feel something massive displacing liquid, rising from the pit, emerging into the chamber they had just vacated. The photographs that Marcus Grell took in those final minutes were recovered weeks later and are now stored in the archives of the British Museum, filed under Unexplained Phenomena, Egypt Collection. They show the four men standing at the edge of the pit, with the afternoon sunlight channeled down from mirrors, creating an artificial brightness in the chamber. In the first photograph, the water is still. In the second, taken 90 seconds later, the surface shows disturbance-concentric rings spreading from the center. In the third photograph, shapes are visible just below the surface, massive and dark. In the fourth and final photograph, the water is erupting upward, and something is visible in the spray, a head the size of a horse's torso, eyes that catch the light and hold it, a mouth opening to show depths that the camera's focal length cannot measure. The photographic plates were found in Grell's abandoned camera, which Hassan retrieved 3 weeks after the incident, when a team from the Egyptian Antiquities Service finally entered the chamber to assess the damage. The camera was lying on its side near the pit's edge, partially submerged in water that had overflowed and then receded, leaving behind a crust of dried sediment that chemical analysis later revealed contained organic compounds with no match in any database material that was carbon dated to approximately 3000 BCE, but which showed cellular structures that did not correspond to any known organism, living or extinct. The quality of the photographs is exceptional despite the circumstances of their creation. Grell had been a meticulous craftsman, and even in his terror, he had maintained his technical standards. The focus is sharp, the exposure correct, the composition as good as could be expected, given the chaos unfolding before his lens. Museum archivists who examined the plates noted unusual properties. The negatives show signs of chemical alteration that cannot be explained by standard development processes, as if the image itself had continued to develop long after being fixed, with certain areas darkening over time while others remained stable. The fourth photograph is the one that caused the British Museum to classify the entire collection as restricted. Multiple experts have examined the image and all agree on certain basic facts. Something large emerged from the water, something with biological characteristics that do not match known species. But beyond this consensus, interpretations diverge wildly. Some zoologists suggested it might be an unknown species of large eel or python, though they struggled to explain the size and the apparent multiple sets of eyes visible in the photograph. One herpetologist proposed it could be a surviving specimen of Gigantophis, a massive prehistoric snake, though he could not account for the morphological features that seemed to shift between frames, as if the creature's form was not entirely stable. What troubled researchers most was the background of the photograph. Behind the emerging creature, visible in the spray and disturbed water, there appeared to be more coils, more bodies, as if what was surfacing was not a single organism but a fragment of something vastly larger, a piece that had been severed from a whole but retained some terrible connection to its source. The coils in the background were not entirely in focus. Grell's depth of field was set for the foreground, but they were clear enough to count. At least 16 distinct coils, each thick as a man's torso, stacked in the water behind the emerging head. Ashford, when shown the photographs during the investigation, could only confirm that yes, this was approximately what he had seen before they fled the chamber. But he added a detail that had not been visible in the photographs. The creature's eyes had tracked them as they ran, not followed with mechanical precision like a predator stalking prey, but observed with what seemed like recognition, as if it knew them individually, as if in the brief moment of its emergence, it had learned their faces, their names, their essential nature. It looked at us, Ashford testified, the way a scholar might examine a text, with interest, with understanding. And I had the terrible conviction that it was deciding whether we were worth pursuing or whether we would come back on our own. The photographs were cross-referenced with ancient Egyptian artistic depictions of Apep, and scholars found disturbing correlations. The flat, broad head shape matched illustrations from the Book of Gates. The multiple eyes 7 were visible in the clearest photograph corresponded to descriptions in the coffin texts of Apep's 7 gazes that see through stone and flesh and soul. Most significantly, the scales visible on the portion of the neck emerging from the water showed the irregular overlapping pattern that temple artists had rendered with such care in their representations of the chaos serpent, patterns that Egyptologists had assumed were stylistic conventions, but which now appeared to be documentary accuracy. Hassan was the only survivor who could give a coherent account of what happened in the final moments before they fled. He said the serpent rose from the pit with a sound like water falling in reverse, as if gravity was temporarily inverted. The head emerged first, then 20 feet of neck, then the beginning of a body whose full size they never saw because Whitmore shouted for them to run. Dr. Ashford dropped his medical bag. Grell left his camera. They sprinted for the stairs with the sound of water crashing behind them, the sound of stone cracking under massive pressure. Hassan looked back once and saw the serpent's head at the bottom of the stairs, testing the width of the passage with movements that suggested intelligence, calculation. William Brennan at the top hauled them up one by one with the rope, then all 5 men ran from the tomb without looking back. Hassan's testimony, given to Egyptian authorities 3 days later in Cairo, provided details that the others either could not remember or chose not to speak about. He described the serpent's movement as fundamentally wrong. It did not slither like a normal snake, but seemed to flow, as if its body was not entirely solid, as if it was negotiating between physical and non-physical existence with each motion. The scales shifted continuously, overlapping and separating in patterns that created the optical illusion of the body being both closer and farther away than it actually was, making distance impossible to judge accurately. But what haunted Hassan most was the creature's awareness. Could sense its attention focused on him with terrible precision. The hieroglyphs had warned about this, the fragment's ability to recognize individual humans, to mark them, to remember them. And Hassan understood in that moment of flight that he had been recognized not just as a person, but as someone who could read the ancient warnings, someone who understood what the creature was. The serpent knew he knew, and there was something almost like satisfaction in its observation, as if it was pleased that someone finally comprehended the full scope of what had been imprisoned and what was now escaping. The sound that followed them up the stairs was not pursuit but exploration. Hassan heard the serpent moving through the lower chamber, heard stone grinding as its bulk pressed against walls that had been built to contain something far smaller. He heard water sloshing, heard the wet slide of scales across carved hieroglyphs, heard something that might have been breathing or might have been the chamber itself, responding to the presence of something it was never designed to hold in its active state. When Brennan hauled Hassan up the final steps and they emerged into the late afternoon sunlight, the translator's first coherent words were, "We have to seal it now." Not tomorrow. Not when we've gathered supplies. Now. If it reaches the surface before dark, if it finds its way to water. He could not finish the sentence. The hieroglyphs had been explicit about what would happen if the fragment reached the Nile, and Hassan had spent enough time in that chamber, had read enough of the ancient warnings, to believe them completely. The 5 men stood in the desert sun, breathing hard, staring at the tomb entrance that they had forced open 3 weeks earlier against every warning they had received. From below, they could hear movement not violent, not aggressive, but steady and purposeful. Something was climbing the stairs, not quickly, not in pursuit, but with the patient deliberation of something that had waited 3,000 years and saw no reason to rush now that freedom was finally within reach. Whitmore made a decision that probably saved their lives. He ordered everyone to gather stones, anything heavy they could carry, and begin filling the entrance. No discussion, no debate, no pausing to document or photograph. They worked with desperate speed, rolling boulders into the passage, packing smaller stones into the gaps, creating a barrier that would not stop the creature permanently, but might slow it long enough for them to reach safety and organize a proper ceiling. The sound from below grew louder as they worked. They could hear it clearly now, the scrape of scales on stone, the displacement of air as something massive navigated the narrow stairs, the occasional crack of rock splitting under pressure. And beneath these mechanical sounds, something else, a vibration that they felt in their chests rather than heard with their ears, a low-frequency pulse that matched the 7-second rhythm they had documented days earlier. Ashford, hauling a particularly large stone, paused and looked at Hassan with an expression of terrible understanding. "It's calling," he said quietly. "That sound. It's calling to something." Hassan nodded, his face grim. The coffin texts had described this, the fragment's cry across the primordial waters, the signal that would resonate through none and reach Apep itself, telling the great serpent that one of its severed pieces was free and seeking reunion. They sealed the entrance as well as they could, with the materials at hand, then ran for their vehicles, driving away from Saqqara as the sun touched the western horizon. Behind them, as darkness fell, they heard something that made them drive faster, despite the rough desert road. A sound like stone exploding, like the earth itself cracking open, coming from the direction of the tomb they had just abandoned.